These are people that do nothing but complain. They complain. And from where they came from, they got nothing.
At 5:20 a.m., federal tactical teams moved at the exact moment across multiple American states, forcing doors open and pulling Somali suspects out of apartments, garages, and offices that had looked quiet only hours before. ICE, the FBI, and HSI seized fentanyl powder, fake pills, heroin, firearms, and stacks of cash in a coordinated operation that felt less like a routine arrest and more like a wartime sweep. This was not a random bust or a simple fraud case, but a direct strike against a hidden criminal system that had survived for years within ordinary U.S. neighborhoods. What makes this operation even more unsettling is that it did not begin on the street, but inside a Minnesota courtroom, with a single judicial decision that quietly changed everything. Subscribe to Military Power, because this story is only beginning to surface, and what comes next reveals how deep this network truly ran. At the center of the collapse was a Minnesota courtroom, where a case that appeared to be finished suddenly reopened old wounds across the state's justice system. A jury had listened to weeks of testimony, reviewed stacks of financial records, and studied billing logs tied to a Medicaid scheme worth $7.2 million. After only a few hours of deliberation, all 12 jurors agreed on one outcome. The verdict was guilty on every major count. And for prosecutors, it felt like a rare moment when the system worked as designed, moving quickly and clearly against a fraud that had drained public funds meant for care and support. That sense of finality did not last long, because the next decision came not from the jury box, but from the bench, where one ruling would quietly undo everything that had just been decided. The judge did not claim that the fraud never happened, and she did not argue that the evidence was fake or invented. However, she reached a conclusion that stunned both sides of the courtroom. She ruled that the state had failed to prove who exactly controlled the fraudulent actions, despite the jury's belief that the answer was clear, based on patterns of control, benefit, and access to money. With that ruling, the unanimous verdict was erased, not reduced or adjusted, but removed entirely, as if the jury's work had never existed. For many observers inside the courthouse, the moment felt unreal, because verdicts that clear and that fast are rarely disturbed after they are delivered. The impact of that decision spread far beyond the courtroom walls, because it struck at the trust people place in the idea of accountability. When 12 citizens hear the same evidence and reach the same conclusion, the public expects that judgment to carry weight, especially in a case involving millions of dollars in taxpayer funds. Instead, the ruling sent a message that even the strongest cases could collapse without warning, leaving prosecutors uncertain and the public confused. Within days, conversations inside law enforcement circles shifted from celebration to concern, as officials began asking how many other cases built on similar evidence might now be at risk. That sudden uncertainty did not last at the state level for long, because federal agencies closely monitor moments like this. When a verdict disappears in a high-value fraud case, it signals more than a legal disagreement. It suggests a weakness that organized criminals can learn to exploit. Investigators in federal offices began reviewing the file not to re-argue the verdict, but to understand what had really been uncovered during the trial and what might still be hidden beneath the surface. The overturned decision did not end the story, but instead marked the point where it began to grow in a new and more dangerous direction. If you are watching this and wondering whether a unanimous verdict should ever be erased so easily, now is the moment to share your view in the comments, because this question sits at the center of everything that followed. As attention moved away from the courtroom drama, investigators returned to the structure of the fraud itself, and what they found raised deeper concerns. The Medicaid scheme did not rely on a single visible business with a clear office or staff, but rather on a cluster of home care companies that mainly existed on paper. These entities shared addresses, registration details, and administrative contacts, yet none showed signs of real daily operations. There were no busy offices, no steady flow of patients, and no evidence of the services they claimed to provide, only paperwork that generated regular reimbursement payments. Those reimbursements arrived with steady timing, creating the appearance of legitimate activity inside state systems that were designed to trust licensed providers. Once the money landed, however, it did not sit still for long, because cash withdrawals followed a careful pattern that avoided attention. Funds were withdrawn late at night or in the early hours of the morning, in amounts small enough to stay below automatic reporting thresholds, but frequent enough to drain accounts over time. This was not the behavior of someone grabbing fast money for personal spending, but the movement of funds guided by planning and restraint. Investigators noticed that luxury purchases, while present, accounted for only a small fraction of the total flow, which challenged the idea that greed alone drove the operation. Most of the money moved through accounts in ways that suggested it was being positioned rather than spent, as if each transfer served a purpose beyond simple profit. The pattern looked less like a lifestyle scam and more like a financial engine, quietly converting public funds into flexible capital that could be deployed elsewhere without drawing notice. This realization marked a turning point in the investigation, as it forced analysts to shift their focus from who was benefiting from the money to where the money was being spent. Federal teams overlaid withdrawal timelines with data from commercial leases, freight schedules, and service contracts across neighboring states. When those layers were placed side by side, connections began to form that had never been visible inside the boundaries of a single fraud case. The same nights that saw coordinated cash withdrawals also aligned with payments tied to storage facilities and transport services. Those facilities were not located in crowded industrial zones or well-known logistics hubs, but in quiet areas of Wisconsin and Illinois, tucked behind ordinary businesses and rural roads. From the outside, they looked unremarkable, the kind of places people pass every day without a second glance. Their value was not in what they displayed, but in what they concealed, offering secure space and controlled access far from the scrutiny faced by clinics and offices connected to Medicaid billing. As federal analysts traced these links, a clearer picture emerged of how the operation worked across state lines. The home care companies functioned as financial transit points, pulling money out of public systems and redirecting it into a network that had little to do with patient care. Each transfer strengthened a physical corridor built on leases, transport routes, and logistics agreements that moved quietly through the Midwest. What began as a legal dispute over responsibility now pointed toward an organized structure designed to hide its true purpose behind layers of paperwork and distance. The investigation had reached a stage where money trails were no longer abstract lines on spreadsheets, but guides pointing toward real locations and tangible assets. As agents prepared to follow those trails on the ground, it became clear that the next phase would leave the courtroom behind and enter places where the stakes were far higher. Darkness still shrouded the industrial edges of the Midwest when enforcement teams took their final positions, moving without lights and communicating only through hand signals and brief radio clicks. Engines idled at a distance, doors closed with care, and agents stepped onto gravel and concrete that felt cold through their boots. The timing mattered because these locations were active at night and quiet by morning, and the goal was to enter before anything could be moved or erased. Across several sites in Wisconsin and Illinois, teams waited for the same signal, knowing that once it came, there would be no pause and no second chance. When the order was given, doors were forced open almost at once, metal screaming against frames as teams pushed inside with weapons raised and eyes scanning every corner. The air inside carried a stale chemical smell that did not belong to any medical supply business, and dust lifted from the floor with each step forward. Lights snapped on, cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of stacked crates wrapped in clean, white material and labeled with meticulous medical markings. The scene looked organized and calm on the surface, but the silence only heightened the tension, because everyone inside understood that this was no clinic, and the storage room was not meant for patient care. Agents moved methodically from crate to crate, cutting seals and lifting lids while others covered hallways and doorways. Inside, most containers were empty or held thin padding designed to protect contents that were never there, a clear sign that these crates had been used for transport rather than storage. Swabs taken from the surfaces returned fast alerts, showing residue linked to fentanyl and other narcotics that had passed through in bulk. The markings on the crates told one story, but the evidence clinging to their walls said another, and it was far more dangerous. Outside, additional teams secured loading docks and parking areas, stopping any vehicle that approached and checking plates against a list built during weeks of surveillance. Some drivers froze when they saw federal badges in the dark, while others attempted to justify their presence with paperwork that did not align with the activity inside the buildings. Radios filled with short updates as each location confirmed entry, clearance, and initial findings. The coordination felt like a battlefield operation, with each unit moving in rhythm to prevent any escape or destruction of evidence. As the search expanded, the scale of the operation began to reveal itself through numbers rather than noise. Inventory records recovered on site, combined with shipping schedules and weight limits, indicated a volume far exceeding personal dealings or local distribution. Analysts on standby calculated the capacity of the crates and the frequency of movement, arriving at an estimate that even seasoned agents found stunning. Over time, these sites had supported the movement of roughly 6.2 tons of narcotics, a figure that transformed the meaning of what was being uncovered in real time. This discovery changed the atmosphere inside the buildings, because it confirmed that these locations were not side projects or experiments. They were key nodes in a corridor designed to move drugs across state lines with speed and control, using clean labels and trusted routes to stay invisible. Every crate had been part of a system, and every system had been built to survive inspection by appearing harmless. The fraud that first drew attention now seemed small compared to the physical reality of what had been passing through these walls. Federal supervisors on the scene adjusted their approach as the implications became clear, directing teams to preserve the layout of the sites while documenting every mark, stain, and modification. Floors were lifted to check for hidden compartments, walls were scanned for false panels, and vents were inspected for residue left behind by previous shipments. Each detail mattered because it showed intent and scale, not just presence. The careful design of these spaces revealed planning that went far beyond financial crime. At one location, agents found evidence of repeated use, with wear patterns on the floor and scuff marks that matched the movement of heavy pallets. At another, packaging materials were stacked in a way that suggested rapid turnover rather than long-term storage. These signs painted a picture of constant motion, where goods arrived, paused briefly, and then moved on again under the cover of routine logistics. The corridor functioned because it never stopped, and because it never drew attention to itself. As dawn approached, the sites fell silent under federal control, with evidence logged and secured, and teams rotating to maintain custody. The early light revealed surroundings that blended seamlessly into their neighborhoods, with warehouses situated near fields and roads that carried farm traffic and delivery trucks every day. This setting was part of the strategy, allowing the operation to hide in plain sight while moving dangerous cargo through communities that had no idea what passed nearby each night. By mid-morning, briefings began to take shape, and the language used to describe the case shifted in tone. This was no longer framed as a Medicaid fraud investigation that had grown complicated, but as a narcotics operation uncovered through financial trails. The distinction mattered because it changed what tools could be used and who would lead the next steps. State-level cases depend on narrow proof tied to specific acts, while what had been found here demanded a broader response. Federal authorities stepped forward to take control, citing the scope of the corridor and its clear impact across state lines. Charges considered now included wire fraud connected to the movement of money, narcotics conspiracy tied to the volume and coordination of drugs, and interstate transport violations linked to the routes that fed the network. The collapse of the earlier verdict no longer looked like an endpoint, but like a trigger that cleared the path for more decisive action under federal law. For state prosecutors watching from the sidelines, the shift was both sobering and revealing. The standards that apply in state court have struggled to contain a case built on layers of distance and delegation, where control was hidden behind paperwork and time gaps. The federal framework, however, treated the corridor as a single operation, measuring its harm through movement and capacity rather than direct presence at every step. That difference made intervention not only possible but necessary. The message sent by the takeover was unmistakable because it showed that when a network grows beyond the reach of local systems, the response does not stop. Instead, it escalates, drawing in agencies with broader authority and deeper resources. The verdict that once seemed to erase accountability had, in fact, exposed a structure that demanded even closer attention. What began as a dispute over responsibility now stood as evidence of a system that required dismantling from the top down. As agents prepared to move from the warehouse floors back to conference rooms and command centers, the focus shifted again, this time toward the financial and transport backbone that had kept the corridor alive. The raids had revealed where the drugs passed through, but the next phase would target how the operation sustained itself and who enabled its movement across the country. The operation did not slow after the raids, because the next strike did not require doors to be forced or crates to be opened. In secure offices far from the warehouses, federal teams shifted focus to the accounts that had fed the corridor for years. Computer screens replaced flashlights, and quiet rooms replaced concrete floors. But the pressure remained just as intense. This phase moved with the same discipline as the raids, because timing mattered and hesitation could allow money to vanish with a single click. Inside Treasury offices, analysts worked through lists of accounts linked by patterns uncovered during the investigation. Each name was checked against the transaction histories, shell companies, and shared identifiers that tied the network together. When the final approvals were given, the response was immediate and sweeping. Hundreds of accounts were frozen simultaneously, halting transactions in midstream and leaving balances frozen in place without warning. The effect spread quickly across the network because these accounts were not isolated savings or personal funds. They were working accounts used to pay rent, move goods, and maintain transport schedules. Payments failed in real time, trucks were denied access to fuel and service, and vendors saw transfers bounce back without explanation. The corridor that once relied on smooth financial flow began to seize up strand by strand. At the exact moment, FBI teams moved against the logistics backbone that had carried narcotics across state lines. Contracts that once looked harmless were flagged and suspended, and transport partners received notices that changed their risk calculations overnight. Vehicles tied to the network were tracked, stopped, and removed from service where authority allowed, breaking the rhythm that had kept goods moving quietly through the Midwest. Dispatch centers that once coordinated pickups and drop-offs fell silent as communication channels were cut and schedules collapsed. Drivers waited for instructions that never came, and routes that had been rehearsed for months were abandoned. Each interruption forced the network to expose itself, because the system had been designed to function only when everything proceeded on schedule. ICE units added another layer of pressure by turning attention to residency and benefit records tied to individuals connected to the operation. Files were pulled, reviewed, and cross-checked against financial and travel data already in federal possession. The process was methodical and thorough, designed to identify who still had legal access to benefits and who no longer met the requirements. This review was not loud or public, but it carried weight because it threatened the stability many relied on to operate without fear. Appointments were missed, applications stalled, and notices arrived that demanded answers. The quiet nature of the action made it more unsettling because it removed the safety of routine and replaced it with uncertainty. Together, these steps showed a strategy that did not depend on a courtroom outcome. The network did not collapse because a judge ruled or a jury spoke. Instead, its ability to function was stripped away piece by piece. Money could not move, vehicles could not operate, and legal cover began to thin under scrutiny. This approach reflected lessons learned from years of pursuing organized groups that adapt quickly to arrests and trials. Removing individuals can slow operations, but removing capacity stops them. By freezing accounts and cutting logistics, federal agencies denied the network the tools it needed to recover or reorganize. The impact reached beyond those directly involved, sending signals through associated businesses and partners who suddenly found themselves under review. Contracts were questioned, relationships dissolved, and distance from the network became a priority for anyone who wanted to avoid attention. The corridor did not simply break. It lost the support that had allowed it to exist. As days passed, the absence of movement became its own form of evidence. Warehouses remained empty, transport routes stayed unused, and financial dashboards showed nothing but static lines. The silence confirmed what enforcement already knew, that the system could not survive without a constant flow. Federal coordination maintained steady pressure, with agencies sharing updates and adjusting their actions to prevent gaps. No single move was decisive on its own, but together they formed a lock that closed around the network. Each frozen account and each canceled route reduced the chance of revival. The message delivered by this phase was clear and deliberate. Accountability does not always require a verdict, and justice does not always arrive through a courtroom door. Sometimes it comes through the removal of tools that enable harm on a massive scale. As the network struggled to respond and found no space to maneuver, attention turned toward the remaining threads that still connected it to the outside world, setting the stage for the final actions that would determine whether any of the corridors could survive. The story that unfolded did not begin with a chase or a raid, but with a ruling that few expected and even fewer understood. A single decision inside a Minnesota courtroom overturned a unanimous verdict in a $7.2 million Medicaid fraud case. That moment quietly triggered a chain reaction that no one could contain. What initially appeared to be a narrow legal dispute quickly expanded, eroding confidence in the state justice system and drawing the attention of federal agencies that had been watching closely from the sidelines. That ruling did not close a case, it opened a door. As investigators pressed forward, the focus shifted away from courtroom language and toward the fundamental structure behind the fraud. The abuse of Medicaid funds was undeniable, but it soon became clear that it was only the outer layer of a much larger operation. Shell home care companies existed on paper, pulled steady public reimbursements, and then passed that money along with careful control. The funds did not vanish into reckless spending. They moved with purpose, feeding a hidden corridor that connected money, transport, and protection across multiple states. When enforcement teams followed those paths beyond the paperwork, the accurate scale of the threat came into view. What had been labeled a fraud case revealed itself as a drug corridor capable of moving massive volumes of narcotics while hiding behind legitimate systems. That discovery changed everything. The response was no longer about proving intent in a single courtroom. It became about stopping a network that functioned like infrastructure, built to survive arrests and legal delays. Federal authorities acted with that reality in mind. Instead of waiting for another verdict, they moved to dismantle the system itself. Accounts were frozen, logistics routes were cut, and the financial and transport capacity that kept the corridor alive was stripped away. This takedown did not depend on one defendant or one judge. It succeeded because it targeted the tools that allowed the network to operate at scale. What this case ultimately confirmed is a hard truth. The Medicaid fraud was never the fundamental objective. It was camouflage. The actual target was the network that used trusted programs as cover to move drugs and power quietly through American communities. Looking ahead, the implications are unsettling. If legal standards and oversight gaps continue to be exploited, similar networks may already exist under different names and different programs. Each exposed case raises the likelihood that federal agencies will intervene earlier and with broader authority, acting more quickly before state systems begin to fracture. The threshold for intervention is changing. Subscribe to Military Power for continued coverage of the hidden battles shaping law enforcement and national security, and ask yourself this: how many other cases labeled as simple fraud are actually criminal corridors still waiting to be exposed?